What is the fundamentalism that is infecting our politics and our religion via Christian nationalism, white fascism, and the like? It is a disease of patriarchy that has replaced the spiritual meaning making that myths or mythos have always done for us. Instead, put in concrete ideas via logos. That would lead me to ask, what is a myth? Is it a falsehood? Is it history? Is it a story about a god or goddess? Is it a legend? Is it in fact a fact? And how in the world do myths affect us today? And why should we care? If we want to understand how to address the modern ills of our society, this is another vital step in that process, is understanding what myths are and how they impact us in the modern age. Welcome to week 6. Just a quick reminder, please go back and make sure that you've watched the first 5 videos in the series. I will place the link to the playlist somewhere up there. Basically, it's season 1, fundamentals of deconstructing patriarchy. Every video builds on top of the other videos or the previous videos. So it's going to be important that you watch the previous videos because I'm going to reference them in this series. Last week, we learned about the mirage that history is. We learned that it's more about probability than it is about certain facts. We learned that scholars and historians often don't agree with one another about how to piece history together, even though we're taught as if this is 100% fact. And we learned that there's tons of blurred lines between mythos, myth, and history, especially in our religions, our creation stories, and our cultural identity stories. I'm going to put this caveat out here. Myth in mythos is diving into the unconscious, the mysterious, the magical, the sensational, the unknown. And it's not meant to be using your logical, rational mind to understand what myth is. They're two completely different things. And in fact, we're going to explore what happens when you take myth and make it logos or rational, logical fundamentalism. That is where a lot of the ill is coming in our society today. Before we do that, though, I want to dive in to really give us a working definition of what a myth is. It's not just about the Greek goddesses and gods. There was the little tool from week 1. They're not false stories. They're actually true stories. We're going to use that in a definition. And they're not just history either. The second thing we're going to do is learn how myths are powerful cultural DNA transmitters. Just as you've heard me say this before, DNA makes up who we are, our personalities, our eye color, our hair, skin, all of that. Our cultural DNA makes up our cultural identity. Number 3, we're also going to try to understand why myths feel 100% true as if they are facts. Next week on the docket, we're going to dive into what the difference is between mythos, which is what we're talking about, obviously, and logos, which is rational, logical thought. I hope you will continue to join me because I actually had a big aha moment when I was putting this material together for that episode. And I think it's going to help you understand what I said at the beginning of this episode, which is understanding why fundamentalism is infecting us in the way that it is. So stay tuned. We got a lot to cover. Let's dive in. All right. So step 1, what do? We like to define words so that we have a working definition of how this is being used in our toolbox with deconstructing patriarchy. And I have to be honest, I hadn't actually looked up the word in the etymology for quite a while, or Merriam-Webster or the Urban Dictionary, probably out. Well, I'm sure I did at some point, but gosh, no wonder we are so confused. There were so many different definitions. I think a colloquial understanding of myth in our modern age is that it's just a fun, false story, usually about the goddesses and gods of Greek. That's usually what we think of myth. Historians, to add to the confusion, use myth in different ways. They don't always define myth as the same thing. Let's start with the etymology and then we'll move on to the dictionary definitions and see what we can come up with. The etymology comes from the French word myth from 1818 and directly from the Latin mythos or from the Greek mythos. And they're defining it as speech, thought, word, discourse, conversation, story, saga, tale, and they use the word myth there. Anything delivered by the word of mouth. So maybe the oral tradition is what they were trying to get at. It's a word unknown in origin. It can quite possibly be Greek. And one other little saying that they said in the etymology was that it's stories about divine beings generally arranged in a coherent system. They are revered as true and sacred. They are endorsed by rulers and priests closely linked to religion. All of these definitions, the reason I'm doing all this work is because there's something called the collective unconscious. It's like this data bank, if you will, an external hard drive that we're all pulling from. And these words have been built over hundreds, if not thousands of years. So this one word has all of this built into it. That's why it's so complex and so complicated to try to understand what myth is in this day and age. If you remember back to when I talked about semantics, I can't remember what week that is, but words change over time. And it's kind of like a building. If you look at some of the buildings in Europe, you'll see the Moorish influence, and then you'll see the Christian influence, and then you'll see, whatever came next. That's what our language is doing, right? We're building on the previous generation's understanding of what a word is. Let's move on to the Merriam-Webster definition. Number 1, a usually traditional story of ostensibly, that means apparently, historical events that serves to unfold part of the world view of a people or explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. I will be upfront that this is probably the closest definition I would use to what a myth is in how it acts on the human psyche and the collective unconscious in this day and age. B, still under that first definition, it can be a parable or an allegory. Number 2 in Merriam-Webster that I found helpful is a popular belief or tradition that has grown up around something or someone, especially one embodying the ideals and institutions of a society or segment of society. So I think of the woman during World War II, right? We can do it. What was her name? She was an American myth. She embodied this sentiment that the culture wanted women to take on as the men were going off to war. Let's move on to Urban Dictionary. So Urban Dictionary had lots of different definitions. Urban Dictionary is where people can go in and type their own, colloquial understanding of that word. But I took the top one, seems to be the most accurate for what we're looking for to understand myth in our work. And there's an example of how they use this. I think it's quite funny, so I'm going to share that too. A story about mystical beings, powers, or events otherwise impossible to perform in reality that only exist in imagination. Their example, the female orgasm, that's a myth. I'm not going to speculate on who wrote that, but somebody obviously doesn't know that this is actually not a myth. That's neither here nor there for this episode. Maybe something later down on the topic list. So between the etymology, the Urban Dictionary, and Merriam-Webster, what can we do to define myth in our work together? You might want to get a pen and paper. I wrote out quite a bit that I wanted to make sure we incorporate into our definition. A myth is 1, a traditional story that is also a current popular belief or tradition still being told or just known in the culture as if it was true. 2, it descends from a certain tribe, culture, community, or country. 3, this story grows, evolves with the people surrounding it, shaping and reshaping itself based on the current needs. 4, historical events are wrapped up into it in an invisible way so that history becomes myth and myth becomes history. 5, it embodies the ideals, norms, institutions in a specific worldview, the DNA, if you will, for that family, tribe, or society's survival. 6, it serves to explain, i.e. give meaning or make meaning of a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon, especially out of the chaos and seemingly randomness in life. All right, how are you feeling? 6 points to what a myth is. I told you this was a really meaty subject. I hope that really helps make it clear as to why this is such a meaty topic and why myths are really these living, breathing entities within our collective conscious and unconsciousness that are ever shaping and reshaping themselves with our current needs in society in this present day and age. So let me see if I can condense that a little bit. It's basically a traditional story, ancient story, that has migrated itself into our collective consciousness as of today. So it's growing with society, but it originated with a certain tribe, country, religion back in that day. Historical events are often wrapped up into a myth so that we can't identify what's myth and what's history very easily. These myths embody the things that we want to pass down to our next generation via our cultural DNA. How are they going to survive? What's important for them to know? Keep that in mind. And it serves to give meaning to that society, that tribe, that family. Hopefully you got that. If not, please leave me your questions in the comments below or join us on our live. Check below for the time, date, and link to that. Let's move on to quotes that help define what myth is. So in my applied mythology class that I took at Pacifica Graduate Institute this past summer, they used a lot of quotes to describe what a myth is. And I find if I stay out of that rational mind and just kind of stay a little, I guess, you can compare it to being in a more meditative state when your mind just kind of expands, your understanding expands, and you're not thinking rationally, then there's this strange thing that happens where myths actually make more sense. If that makes sense, I hope so. Let me know. If not, we'll work on it on the live. Let me read a couple quotes to you that I think really will help you understand what a myth is. The first one comes from Bart Ehrman. He is a biblical historian that works at Duke, and he teaches New Testament history. His quote for me gets at the heart of what a myth is, and maybe it's a little more succinct than my 6-part definition. He says, a myth is a history-like story that is meant to convey a religious truth. The story itself is fictional, even though it is told like a historical narrative. But its point is to teach something that is true, not that something actually happened. Now, I want you to sit with that for a second and see how that feels when you think about maybe Jesus walking on water. Did it actually happen? That's not the point of the story. The point of the story is to point out something that's true. And I'm going to get into that in a second to help you understand that a little bit better. Here are some quotes from my applied mythology course from the summer that I wanted to read to you. This one is a Hasidic proverb. Give people a fact, you enlighten their minds. Give them a story, and you touch their souls. This is why I am writing a historical fiction novel to incorporate all the stuff that I'm teaching you, because I realized that if I could do this inside of a book, inside of a story, people might actually grasp the concept of what I'm trying to do a little bit easier. But I think it's also important to teach the nonfiction side. Moving on. Karen Armstrong said this originally, but then my teacher Michael Mead also said this a lot. If this sounds familiar, it is because Jordan Peterson also quotes this a lot without giving any credit to Karen or Michael Mead. Myth isn't about what's happening in the past. Myth is about what happens all the time. This is from one of my other teachers, Kwame Scruggs. He said myths aren't just for putting children to sleep, they're for waking adults up too. Again, you might have to sit with all of these, especially as we work with myths a little bit more. These are some of the ones I came up with that helped me understand what myths were this summer. Myths are lies that tell the truth, and myths are false on the outside, but true on the inside. This quote is from Denise de Romont. It's French. I don't speak French, so I apologize. And it was translated by Montgomery Belgian from one of Denise's book, if I'm saying that correctly. And he said about myths, when an event is too dangerous to be discussed, it is formed inside a myth and told as a story. I believe he was talking about Jesus' story. I think he was a Christian, but I love that quote. Another way to think of myths is emotional truths. They convey something, again, that might be true, even if the historical event is not an actual event. They explain how we behave in a certain way, often providing a metaphor for universal human behavior. I often like to think of myths as the ancients' way for having psychology, helping them to have a way to understand their mind, their psyche, their soul before modern psychology was invented. Let's look at a couple examples in this category. Pandora's box, for example. It's not literally about a woman opening a box and it's full of chaos being unleashed onto the world. It's a way to explain the struggle with humanity's curiosity and the possible consequences of where that curiosity could lead someone or lots of someone. Returning back to the example of Jesus walking on water, it's not about a literal miracle because we can't prove that miracles ever happened. There's a whole reason we can't do that. I'm not going to go into that here, but we're actually wanting to look to see, is there maybe a truth in there, a spiritual truth that we can learn from? And yeah, I believe there is, even though I'm not a Christian and I do not believe in Jesus in this day and age. We can look at the fact that there is chaos in the world, like a storm. It comes up out of nowhere. We're not able to control it. We can drown in the middle of it, right? I'm talking about the chaos that comes up from events in our lives, but also from the internal chaos of our psyche. Jesus walking on water could have a couple different implications. It could mean we could look at this human being who has this supernatural power to control the elements, and if we put our faith in him, somehow he magically is able to control the chaos in the world. I think that is not as accurate as what can we do if we see the chaos coming in our world. If it comes up out of nowhere, how do we center ourselves to be able to hold ourselves in or on top of that storm in a way where the storm is still raging around us, but we don't let it sink us? I think that's probably the closer truth of that myth. Now let's look at why myths can feel so true, as if they are just part of human DNA, part of human nature. In order to do this, though, we have to remember that myths got passed down from oral tradition. And oral tradition wasn't really looking at establishing a historical accurate fact by fact, by fact, by fact to paint this puzzle of the past, these myths carry not the facts necessarily, but the cultural knowledge, the moral lessons, and the survival tips that they would need to survive from generation to generation. More than this, though, they explained the unexplainable and gave meaning to life. We're going to look at a passage by Clarissa Pinkola Estes first and foremost. Then we're going to move on to understand a little bit more about the context of oral stories and when these stories started to be written down, what was happening in the contextual sense. Doing all of that, that's actually going to help us get at why myths feel so true, even if they're not. Now, I'm going to read this passage from Clarissa Pinkola Estes' book, The Women Who Run with Wolves. I mentioned her in a previous video. She is a PhD. She is a Jungian analyst. And if you don't know who Carl Jung is, he was a counterpart to Freud, and he believed more in the looking at the active imagination, dreams, and archetypes to be able to understand the psyche. So it's just a different version of psychology than Freud's. She is also what's called a cantadora, or a storyteller in her culture. She was trained up to be in these trance-like states to be able to tell stories. I want to read this little excerpt for you because I think it's going to help you understand how these stories get woven over hundreds of thousands of years to embed truths, maybe not facts, but truths, and maybe not history, but truths into our DNA, into the present day and age. So let me start with this. I once dreamt I was telling stories and felt someone patting me on the foot in encouragement. I looked down and saw that I was standing on the shoulders of an old woman who was studying my ankles and smiling up at me. I said to her, "No, no, no, come stand on my shoulders, for you are the old and I am young." "No, no," she insisted. "This is the way it is supposed to be." I saw that she stood on the shoulders of a woman far older than her, who stood on the shoulders of a woman even older, who stood on the shoulders of a woman in robes, who stood on the shoulders of another soul, who stood on the shoulders, ... I believed the old dream woman about the way it was supposed to. The nurture for telling stories comes from the might and endowments of my people who have gone before me. In my experience, the telling moment of the story draws its power from a towering column of humanity joined one to the other across time and space, elaborately dressed in the rags and robes or nakedness of their time, and filled to the bursting with life still being lived. There's a little bit of that Karen Armstrong quote where it's not an event that happened once, it's always happening, right there in her description of this. There is a single source of story, and the Newman of story, this long chain of humans, is it. Oh God, this is so powerful. Story is far older than the art and science of psychology, and will always be the elder in the equation no matter how much time passes. One of the oldest ways of telling, which intrigues me greatly, is the passionate trance state, wherein the teller senses the audience, be it in an audience of one or of many, and then enters a state in the world between worlds, where a story is attracted to the trance teller and told through her. The trance teller calls on El Duende, the wind that blows soul into the faces of listeners. A trance teller learns to be psychologically double-jointed through the meditative practice of story, that is, training oneself to undo certain psychic gates and ego apertures in order to let the voice speak. The voice that is older than the stones. When this is done, the story may take any trail, be turned upside down, be filled with porridge and dumped out for a poor person's feast, be filled with gold for the taking, or chase the listener into the next world. The teller never knows how it will all come out, and that is at least half of the moist magic of story. Okay, we're done. We don't need to describe anymore. That is the power of the oral tradition of story. And that is what I am trying to get at in describing why myths feel so true. Because it's like taking a little bit of this DNA from the ancient and it's been passed down through story over time. Whether that story is of any benefit to us in this day and age, I would say most of the creation stories we're buying into are not of benefit in this day and age. But they still get embedded into our DNA to the point where we can't tell if they're myth or actual history, but it shows you the power of story in our lives. I know that marketing in the last 5 to 10 years has really gotten into the power of storytelling and how it really gets into our psyche in a way that nothing else can. That is what I'm trying to really get you to see in the power of myths, whether they're good for us or not. Here's another thing we have to keep in mind. When we're looking at myths and their power, we have to understand the context. I talked about this in a previous episode. Let me add some more context for you as to where some of these creation stories came from. We talked about this a little bit in episode 4 when we really set the foundation for what does it mean to deconstruct. Deconstruct, you really have to look at what you're looking at in a contextual way in order to understand what they meant when they wrote that story down. So here's something that I learned actually in my last days as a Christian that started to change everything for me. And it was understanding that the ancients didn't really care about how, in the sense that we do in our modern day and age with science built into our psyches and our logos. They wanted to know more about the meaning and the reasoning behind the story, especially if it helped them understand their place in the world and how to deal with the chaos that they saw life was around them on this planet. For example, they weren't interested in how did the sun rise in the east and set in the west. They were more interested in why did it rise and set. And a lot of the stories, a lot of the myths you can see describe this story. They were interested in why do humans suffer, especially having a consciousness. Why do we have a consciousness and why are we attuned to that suffering? They were interested in why we are here and why we have this consciousness that we're here. And they were really interested in survival. The Genesis story, again, isn't about how God created the world. It was about what was important for survival for the tribe to know and pass down from generation to generation. As Elaine Pagels pointed out in her book, Why Religion? It is a story about how to create culture, starting with the use of sexual energy. Building on that premise, she adds this. Ideas are written into social codes via stories, i.e. creation stories, and thus woven into behavior. Creation stories help create the cultural world by transmitting traditional values. These traditional values then therefore become the invisible scripts running society, telling us what is normal and what is deviant from the normal. So this is where we get to pull all this together and understand why myths feel so true, as if they're just human nature. Again, these invisible scripts that have now been passed down over probably millennia have gotten embedded into our DNA invisibly. We don't see them. I keep saying that. Hopefully you got that by now. When our personal feelings bump up against that cultural DNA, we think that the cultural DNA is accurate, not our personal feelings. We don't question the story. We question our personal feelings. We therefore then feel guilty and we feel ashamed. So then we therefore use that power of homeostasis to get ourselves back in line with the cultural story. We're not wrong, but because our cultural story tells us that we're wrong, we don't question ourselves. We're not wrong. We just feel like we're wrong because our personal nature is bumping up against this cultural story that we've been taught subliminally most times is true. Instead of questioning the cultural story like we should be doing, we question ourselves. This is why myths feel like they're 100% accurate. Natural order is men are supposed to lead and women are supposed to follow because it's been embedded for millennia into our cultural DNA. Let's pause here. What if we had never heard these stories before? What if we never heard the story of Genesis and how it's one man and one woman and she's going to pine after her husband forever and he's going to have to work the earth by the sweat of his brow? What if we never heard these freaking stories and we just got to experience our life without a story put on top of our experiences? How different would our world be right now? All right, pause over. How did that go for you? Back to our course. This also leads into what we were discussing a couple episodes back about Aristotle and Plato and the early Christians and how women are the second sex and it's natural order. They were bumping against that cultural DNA story saying this is how it is, and they weren't questioning it. They were just defining what they already saw around them and writing that down, unfortunately, in concrete stone. Well, actually, it might have been papyrus, and passing it on to future generations as if that was true. So that gives you a little bit more deeper of an understanding of how all of this works. Moving back to Karen Armstrong, she had a lot to say about what ancients needed from their stories. In her short book, A Short History of Myth, which is a quick and easy read if you want to dive into more of how to understand myths, she said this, and we've already looked at this once. A myth is something that in some sense happened once, but which also happens all of the time. This means that myths, unlike historical events, are not bound by time. They live on because they speak to universal human experiences. This is how a creation story has lived for 3,500 years and is so real to so many of us in different ways in this day and age. Stories were a way for them to process the unknown, the chaos, the undefined of their world. They didn't have science like we do nowadays. They were healing because they provided a shared narrative to the chaos and gave meaning to it. However, as we examined a few episodes back, as these stories got written down literally into concrete stones and then papyrus, they lost some of that flexibility and they started to become more concrete stories without the ability of that trance-like state that we saw in Clarissa's reading from a few minutes ago. But just because they've become static does not mean that they've lost their grip on our human psyche. Quite the contrary. They continue to shape our beliefs, our values, and our behaviors, often without us even realizing. Here's a little bonus for you today. We're going to talk about rituals, because rituals and myths go hand in hand. Now, I can think about, after being a Christian for 16 years, most of what we did in the church are ritualized mythology. Hopefully, by me just saying that, you'll start to understand what rituals and myth have to do with each other. Rituals are a way to keep the myth alive in an even more ingrained, embodied way. Like we are these embodied souls. We cannot separate our consciousness from our bodies. And rituals help bring those myths into our lived experience, into our bodies in a very real way. Armstrong has this to say about rituals. Myths demand participation. They're not passive contemplation. This is part of what makes them so powerful when we bring the intellectual, spiritual into the somatic body and physical world. In ancient times, myths were woven into rituals, festivals, special days that helped people embody their truths. Without this transformative participation, myths lose their power to connect us to something greater than ourselves. Besides seeing this play out in our religious traditions, we also have our cultural traditions where rituals play an important part. 4th of July, Christmas, Easter, New Year's Eve. They all are this active participation in a story, in a mythology, in order to give our lives meaning, purpose, and cultural identity. Another quote from Karen, just love this woman, myth cannot be fully understood without a transformative ritual, bringing it into hearts and minds of the worshiping. A myth demands action. If history is shaped by storytelling and myths are reflecting cultural truths, how do these stories we're telling ourselves influence our lives today? What other myths, besides a lot of the ones I've already mentioned, are quietly but yet loudly still shaping our beliefs on a personal and cultural level? And what happens when we refuse or cannot find our way out of allowing mythos to be mythos and instead make our mythos into logos, into rational and logical thought? That is what we're going to dive into in our next video, so please stay tuned. It's really going to help us understand fundamentalism and where it stems from, and it stems from, spoiler alert, turning mythos into logos. So next video, we're going to look at what is mythos and what is logos, and what happens when we trade one for the other, making mythos logos. This is where I had a big aha moment for myself and cannot wait to share it with you. What is one myth as fact that you are now seeing clearly in your life? It can be from the dating world, relationship world, religious, political, social. It can be from any of these worlds. All of them have myths built into them as if they are facts. What's one that you see? Drop it in the comments below and let's talk about it. Also, drop in a separate comment. What is your golden nugget? What are you taking away from this lesson? I will see you next time. So much love. Bye-bye.